Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar, or good morning, or perhaps good evening. I see people from all around the world have joined. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on the GCF today. The webinar will cover the publication we put together, the GCF Insight. It will include a discussion about the GPIC, the GCF Private Investor Conference that took place a while ago, about a month or so ago, and also the feedback, some observations we've made from the board meeting 24 that took place last week. So there's a lot to put into the agenda. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this meeting. I'll just say just one or two words about myself and our company. My name is Grant. I'm the CEO of the company ECO. We're a London-based consulting company that is specialised in the design and formulation of low-carbon, climate-resilient projects and programs. Our specialist consultants work on projects with international governments, development banks, local communities all around the world, and really take a multidisciplinary approach to the work that we do. To complement our consulting work, we also provide international training and capacity building courses around project formulation for public and private sector institutions, with the aim of furthering global skills and understanding of international finance mechanisms, particularly climate finance. And this webinar is really within that context. The webinar aims to really increase awareness about the opportunities and challenges related to climate finance. We really hope it's useful for you. We have a chat, which a number of you have already discovered. There's a chat box on the right of your screen. Feel free to put in messages as the webinar is going along. There's also a questions tab, which you can select. If you have a question, really do just type it in as you have the question, and we'll come to address those questions as soon as we can. And we'll also be introducing a poll during this webinar, and that's on the polls tab. It's not going to jump up in front of you on the screen. You go to the polls tab and answer the question that we're going to put there. So I think that's it. I'm just looking at my colleagues. Yes, we're good to go. Without any further ado, let's continue. So the first step is the poll. I'm just going to launch the poll now. How do we do it? Okay, well, a colleague of mine will launch the poll. First time we've done that. Yes, it's already launched. Good, fantastic. So the question we're asking, because this webinar is focused on climate finance, is, in your opinion, what is the primary knowledge gap in climate finance? We've done some testing in terms of our normal GCF Insight. We often do a survey. In this case, we approached a number of experts around the world to ask them the question about what are gaps in climate finance. So the same question as you have here, and produced a GCF Insight publication, which this time is really fascinating issue, which I'll let our consultant Sylvia speak about in a moment. Sylvia is a consultant with 8 years of experience in sustainable energy and climate change sectors. Her experience focuses on integrating social inclusion and sustainability in project and business model design. And she's an expert with experience in research in several African countries. She works on developing GCF project proposals and concept notes here at ECO, with a focus on increasing climate resilience of marginalized communities and women in African countries. So over to Sylvia
This 13th edition of the GCF Insight explores the most significant knowledge gaps in climate finance, as they've been identified by key stakeholders, and also discusses the implication for the Green Climate Fund. There's been a significant progress in disseminating information on climate finance flows, funds architectures, project development, and scoping for climate finance opportunities. However, knowledge gaps persist, and particularly for those stakeholders who should benefit from accessing those funds. So in this report, we identified what were these main knowledge gaps, and we based our research on conversations that we had with the key stakeholders from GCF Secretariat, international organizations and accredited entities, as well as international consultants. But really, the first question that we asked ourselves was, whose knowledge are we talking about? Which groups and stakeholders are knowledgeable about climate finance, and which ones instead lack essential information for accessing these funds? And the study indicates there is an information access disparities, that climate finance knowledge, it is available, but not to those who would benefit from it. And these similar results are also reflected into the various funds' unequal portfolios. For example, looking at the GCF, 82% of funding is committed through international accredited entities, and 50% of the readiness portfolio is implemented by international delivery partners with framework agreements. So really, when talking about knowledge and access to climate finance, the first step for meaningful engagement, for making sure that those who benefit are able to participate in decision-making processes, means that they need to first and foremost access to climate finance knowledge as a first step. So the top 5 climate finance knowledge gaps identified in the study are related to climate finance fundamentals, what are the funds, what are the criteria, and how to access them. Another theme is related to financial instruments and project finance, mentioned by most respondents. Then we have private sector engagement and market transformation. As a fourth theme is local ecosystem and country contexts, and understanding how projects have an impact on the local context. And lastly, a fifth theme identified was related to trends, needs, and best practices. So for each of these key themes, we looked at what were the top knowledge gaps for each stakeholder groups. So we looked at project developers and fund beneficiaries, and have, for example, identified that most of the knowledge gaps were related to financial instruments and to understanding the basics of climate finance. For market participants, such as private sectors, commercial banks, there's a lack of understanding about the values, the mechanism associated with climate finance, and as well as risk information. From a donor perspective, there is a limited understanding on how to engage with the private sector, as well as understanding the local banking sector, the country-specific risk profiles, and how to take them into consideration when assessing proposals. While from a policymaker and government perspective, the main knowledge gaps identified were related to the requirements for funding opportunities, but as well how to ensure that policy framework are able to scale up investments and are able to attract private sector. And lastly, from an international community as a whole, so including CSOs, academia, media, there is a lack of knowledge regarding definition, sources, and funds architecture, but as well a lack of sectoral analysis and research needs in terms of technology needs, best practices, what works, what doesn't work when about climate finance. So for the first theme, climate finance fundamentals, we identified that the main knowledge gaps were first and foremost a lack of an agreed definition of climate finance and how to distinguish it, for example, from traditional development finance. That there is a very limited understanding of key concepts such as the climate rationale, how to understand project impacts, additionality, and overall understanding of sectors involved for climate finance. And lastly, there is also a lack of awareness about sources and architecture of climate finance. From a financial instruments and project finance perspective, this was identified as the largest knowledge gaps from a project developer point of view. So often project developers and beneficiaries of these funds lack general knowledge about project financing, don't understand how to distinguish between the different mechanisms and tools, and also lack a general understanding of financial systems. But also donors on their hand lack their capacity and their experience in assessing climate risk, and a lack of understanding for climate risk profile at the country level. On the other hand, project developers often overlook financial risk, currency risk, and have a poor understanding of financial sustainability. The second theme was related to private sector engagement and market transformations. So really here, the main knowledge gap identified was, from a market player's perspective, the lack of understanding whether the values, the mechanism, and risk associated of climate finance, and also a mismatch between the donors' expectations and requirements and what the business community is able and is willing to do. And limited dialogues between the project developers and the business communities, particularly retail bankers, can result in missed opportunities. From a point of view of the local ecosystem and understanding country context and policy frameworks, we identified that project developers often lack capacity to promote local ownership, to build capacity of local stakeholders, and also to include actors in planning processes. There's also limited knowledge of policy actors with streamlining policies that can attract climate finance, and also with design regulatory frameworks that scale up climate investments. And lastly, the fifth theme related to trends, needs, and best practice identified various needs for additional research and for information dissemination. For instance, on best practices for appropriate financial models and tools, and appropriate policy frameworks to scale up investments, and market transformation approaches. And also there's a lack of data, or at least a lack of available knowledge for technology needs in given country contexts, as well as trends in climate finance from a sectoral perspectives, and looking, for example, at the impacts of public versus private climate finance. The study identified needs for additional research, such as best practice for sectoral investments and for legal frameworks to scale up investments, but also for dedicated capacity building of selected stakeholders. And a first step really relates to the development of knowledge sharing platforms and matchmaking supports that enables donors and beneficiaries to be linked. Moving forward, what we would do, we aim at exploring the identified key themes with dedicated GCF insight issues. And really, we aim at capturing a wide range of voices from different stakeholders to identify the most pressing needs, and to identify what type of knowledge they need most access to. Because as we mentioned before, possessing the knowledge of funding options and decision-making processes is really the first step towards transformative participation in the climate finance landscape. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your views, and please check the report for an in-depth analysis. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sylvia. We will now move on to a presentation from my colleagues Mel and Ben, which deals with the GCF Private Investor Conference. You'll see the theme here is around investment and climate finance, and what gaps there are, where the opportunities lie, and such like. We will get round to a question time shortly, so you'll be able to ask questions of Sylvia, you'll be able to ask questions from Ben and Mel. And yeah, we look forward to discussing these things with you. In the meantime, do ask questions using the question tab or in the chat. And also, don't forget, if you haven't already, complete the poll by clicking on the poll slide. We've got so far perhaps about half of respondents. All right, so without any further ado, let's go on to talk about the GPIC, the Green Climate Fund Private Investor Conference. This conference, in this presentation, we're going to also play a pre-recorded segment from someone that was interviewed from the event. So I'm looking forward to that. We have two presenters from ECO's side here. One is Mel. She's a senior consultant in our team with over 20 years of experience in environmental and humanitarian settings, and a wealth of policy and project design experience from around the world. She's graduated from Lund University and wrote her thesis on the circular economy. Ben Bartle, who's also speaking in a moment, is also one of our senior consultants with over 10 years of experience in project formulation. That's for Green Climate Fund projects, GCF, GEF projects as well, Global Environment Facility, and has a lot of experience with climate readiness projects, capacity development, country programming, and strategy development. So yeah, let's go straight into presentation from Ben and Mel.
Thanks for that, Grant. This presentation is going to provide a bit of an overview of the Global Private Investment for Climate Conference that Mel and I attended in Songdo. We'll give a quick overview of the attendees and the key themes coming out of the conference. And then we've got a couple of interviews and contributors, as well as some of the resources that are now available. So the second edition of the GPIC conference, as it's called by the GCF, was, in our eyes, a huge success. It attracted a record number of private sector participants as well as public sector, while also showing that there were visible improvements overall in terms of the quality of the speakers. There was the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Ban Ki-moon was there, the head of MUFG, a Japanese bank also. There was presence of leading financial institutions and institutional investors. More than 40 CEOs actually attended the conference as well. Also, the panel discussions and thematic workshops we found very interesting. And a key focus of the conference has been how to break through the market barriers, which currently mean only a really small fraction of the more than $210 trillion of private sector assets is funneled towards climate change. There are a couple of news releases you can check out on the website. I will show at the end of the presentation. There were also two very successful roundtable sessions with representatives from sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, asset managers, and global banks, which concluded in very strong demand for co-investment solutions with the GCF. There was also an important signed funded activity agreement for a project proposal submitted by the Development Bank of South Africa, as well as a readiness approval that promotes the creation of a green bond market in the Caribbean was also signed.
Yes, and as you can see from the table, there was over 700 attendees at the three-day event, and we could say that these fell into groups from the private sector, institutional, green banking areas, insurance and incubators, renewable energy sector, both technical and financial experts, as well as scientists and academia. We sat down briefly with Ayaan, who is the director of the private sector facility, and asked what was different between this year's event and the lessons that we learned from GPIC 2018. And what Ayaan told us, there was more focus here on climate finance solutions, such as the climate bonds, green banking, insurance and incubators, that showcase how the GCF can be a catalyst in unlocking private sector climate investments in countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. In parallel, informed by the lessons learned from 2018, we've seen an extended conference by one day, which was able to allow for more additional face time to progress some of those deal pipelines, engage on strategic initiatives, and give participants an insider look into the headquarters in Songdo. So what we heard at the conference largely was that there were 5 key themes, and these tended to focus on risk and resilience. So Ben and I are going to go through a couple of the things that popped out for each of these. In terms of adaptation, this was framed at the start of the conference by the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and he talked about the need for an increased investment in a climate change adaptation portfolio, especially given the last couple of years where we've seen something like 470 billion worth of catastrophe losses globally, and how this poses a major macro fiscal risk to country economies. In fact, one panellist commented that where we are now in terms of climate change adaptation is where we were with climate change mitigation some 15 years ago, meaning a serious investment is required. Much of the dialogue around adaptation focused on how to attract and accelerate private sector investments, expectations about returns and risks, and in particular, identification of market barriers and de-risking through the provision of concessional finance such as risk guarantees, insurance, blended loans to crowd in these funds. When we looked at risk, there were a few sub-themes here. We heard a call for greater business investment from Green Climate Fund's Executive Director, Mr. Yannick Blemaric, who said that businesses cannot afford to be passive about climate change because ultimately all investment will be impacted by climate risk and the impact on security and economic livelihoods of
hundreds of millions of people.
We also heard then from the scientific community about the need for more evidence-based information when it comes to decisions around climate financing, especially in the area of risk assessments. One equity fund manager also reminded us about the risk of current investments of FTSE 100 companies, which are largely invested in infrastructure that is not future-proofed or resilient for tomorrow's climate and economy. Insurance was also discussed, and the need for recognition that least developed country losses are generally absorbed by the people on the ground, who are often the most vulnerable. So the question about how can insurance absorb risk and deliver more equitable and inclusive climate change solutions. When we heard about scale, there was a lot of emphasis on replication and the need for catalytic capital to de-risk climate investments to unlock private capital at a scalable level. There were calls from equity firms for project-specific accreditation that's opposed to the traditional blanket accreditations of organisations. And the GCF has now confirmed that this is on the radar, and we'll hear more about that from Ayaan later.
There was also quite a lot of chat around pipelines, and closely linked to scale is pipelines, of course, specifically the need for more transparent and identified investment projects and how many investment projects will be under a GCF project. These are traditionally from the multilateral development banks. Traditional investment portfolios we found are largely, we know are largely made up of renewables, whereas the focus on the future of these portfolios was around the need to mix alternative meats, eco-materials for construction, agribusiness and agribusiness services, sustainable low emissions transport, green cities and sustainable housing, in particular heating and cooling is related to climate change mitigation. Despite the call throughout the conference for climate change adaptation investments, we were reminded that there is a need for 4 to 10 times more investment financing required for climate change mitigation investments if we are to reach the 2 degrees Celsius and not to go above that trajectory. When considering a pipeline, we're also reminded about supply chain constraints under GCF projects, and especially in developing countries. For example, if a decision was made to invest in wind turbines, there are deployment time constraints, which can be up to 2 years for those to be manufactured. And these need to be factored into GCF projects. Overall, the conference spoke a lot to blended finance, but we also looked at public-private partnerships and the role of catalytic funding. We heard from one participant that private-public partnerships, PPP, should not mean pain, but should actually mean properly planned proposals. Multiple discussions were mentioned about governments taking first loss mechanisms within a blended finance framework, while also acknowledging that the private sector can't walk away with all of the profits, and there is a need for profit sharing, with more of the sweet spot being shared, including risk and rewards. including those among attending the GCF roundtables, which I mentioned earlier, were representatives from multinational banks, multilateral development banks, credit risk and insurance agencies, and also financial services firms.
We interviewed Jake Ho, who is with the Lightsmith Group, which is an equity firm, and we asked him these couple of questions in particular.
Lightsmith sees important and attractive investment opportunities in growth stage companies with technologies and solutions for climate resilience, scaling up data and analytics and products and services companies that can help analyze and address the growing risks from climate change is both an important societal need and an attractive investment opportunity. Lightsmith believes there are attractive investments in the tools that address the problem of climate change as that problem gets bigger and more complex. I firmly believe that the GCF has the tools to have a transformative impact on climate action and climate adaptation in particular. By partnering with the private sector and mitigating perceived and actual risk, the GCF can mobilize multiples of capital and the entrepreneurship, innovation, and human capital from the private sector to attack one of the greatest challenges of our time. We have no time to lose. We need to move forward, and we need to move forward together between the public and private sector.
We also spoke with Ayaan Adam, and she said that in response to the questions we have up on the screen there, that GCF's experience during their initial resource mobilisation had shown that reform was necessary to their access modalities, as well as a diversification of the use of instruments would be critical if they were going to realise the fund's catalytic potential. At the outset of 2020 to 2023, she mentioned that they're aiming to test new funding modalities, including, firstly, a project-specific accreditation approach to broaden access to GCF resources. They are looking to do co-investment approaches to engage institutional investors in the GCF portfolio, as well as options for supporting venture-style incubators and accelerators. Lastly, she mentioned they are looking at options around underwriting guarantees in frontier and emerging markets, which is excellent news. Following the strong replenishment that has just concluded in Paris a week or so ago with the US $9.8 billion in pledges, the GCF, she said, stands ready to step up its efforts in promoting private sector action in developing countries.
Yeah, and in regards to the second question there, Ayaan responded that partnerships are key to enhancing climate action, and the private investment for climate conference is a very important marketplace to discuss common grounds on how we're going to set priorities over the next 12 months. She further went on to say that GCF and private sector facility in particular is uniquely positioned to leverage its strategic capabilities in terms of
country-driven,
open collaboration, flexibility of financing instruments and risk appetite to pursue innovative partnerships to scale up, de-risk and demonstrate the financial viability of climate investments. Finally, Ayaan shared with us that they are ready to design and prioritise a high-quality, high-impact pipeline aligned to investments for the GCF1. And next to seeking innovative solutions in adaptation finance, the focus will be also on piloting investments in the forestry and land use sector, as well as in low-emission transportation.
So finally, there was a number of resources that came out of the conference which we recommend you checking out if they're of interest to you. They're available on the website listed at the top of the slide here. In particular, we found the GCF Driving the Transformation to Climate Resilient Financial System quite important, but also available all of the presentations of the conference. So thank you for listening in, and I'll pass it back to Grant.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Mel. Thank you also to Jay and Ayaan, who gave input during that event and helped get their perspectives on things. Thanks for the questions. We're going to get to those very shortly, but just before that, we're going to give some input, some insights into the most recent board meeting. Yeah, board meetings, they take a long time. There's a lot of content there, a lot of discussions. We try to draw out what could be key issues related to our area of interest, which is project formulation. What do we learn in terms of those for projects? That's really where we focus. And this time round, we have two colleagues who are making this presentation now. Firstly, I'll introduce Sadie. Sadie joined our team recently here at ECO. She's experienced conducting research on the SDGs and serving as a civil society advocate at UNFCCC negotiations. And she also had very interesting experience interning at the Independent Evaluation Unit at the Green Climate Fund. So she's been there, walked those corridors, and has good insights into what's happening there on the ground. And we also have inputs from Dorman, who's a PhD student in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Colorado Boulder. You may ask, why is she making this input? Well, her research interests focus on that intersection between equitable energy access, international climate institutions, and development studies. And her thesis research at the moment is investigating if and how the decision-making structures of the Green Climate Fund represent a paradigm shift in sustainable development institutions. So over to Sadie and Diana.
Thanks for that, Grant.
I'm going to be talking to you today about the GCF's 24th board meeting, which recently wrapped up last week in Songdo, Korea. We actually weren't able to attend this board meeting on the ground, but we were watching the live stream, and we're going to be hearing from Diana, who did attend the board meeting. So a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to start with the projects approved and the overall GCF portfolio. Then I'll talk about the new accredited entities that have been approved, a quick update on policies and reports, and the GCF's direction moving forward. So in terms of project approvals, there were 13 projects tabled to be approved, 5 of which were under the simplified approval process. The projects were in 14 countries, and they totaled 407.8 million in GCF funding, but if you add in co-financing, that totals $1.87 billion. There was only one DAE project and none from the private sector, so that's something that the GCF still needs to work on. So here is the list of the projects considered under the simplified approval process. These projects came through relatively smoothly in the approval process. And here's the list of full proposals brought to the board. I've highlighted 3 projects that were a bit contentious. The first being a green development fund to be set up in China, FP82. This project has previously been considered at board meetings, but it was contentious as there were questions from board members from the US and from Japan as to whether the project could have run without GCF funding and whether the GCF should be giving funding to a project which includes some advanced technology research and development in China. But other board members brought up that China, like other developing countries, should have access to funds from the GCF for their sustainable development potential. This is China's first project, and due to the absence of consensus, the board member for the first time used the procedure for decision-making in absence of consensus, which was recently adopted. And so they held a vote on this project, and ultimately it was approved with 2 votes against the project and 1 abstention. The next one I highlighted is FP2019, which is a water banking and agriculture adaptation project in northern Gaza. This is the state of Palestine's first project. 1 board member abstained from the consensus decision-making as they shared the position that the US does not believe that the state of Palestine should receive funding from the GCF, but rather than blocking the consensus, they decided to abstain, and thus the project was approved. And the final one I've highlighted is FP123, which was a RED Plus climate bonds for forest project proposed by IFC, which is the World Bank's private finance arm. This project was set to be considered, but it was pulled by the AE shortly before the meeting. The ITAP stated that the proposal was lacking some measures for country ownership, such as its no objection letters. And there was also criticism of this proposal from civil society as lacking country ownership. The board members raised some issues with the projects being dropped so last minute, as it put into question the process for approving projects. In terms of the overall GCF portfolio, given the approval of these projects, we see that 86% of GCF projects come from international access entities. So the GCF really needs to work on improving access to direct access entities on the project side. In terms of financial instruments, there's 45% grants and 41% loans, and the rest is other financial instruments. We see a fairly balanced regional representation, and 56% of projects are in least developed countries, small island developing states, or in Africa. In terms of entities brought forward for accreditation at this meeting, there were 7 new applicants, 2 of which are the first ever entities in their countries. 5 of these applicants were direct access entities, and 4 of those are private sector, and there were also 2 international applicants. And that brings the total portfolio of accredited entities to 95, 56 of which are direct access entities. There was actually some debate on the accreditation of these entities after civil society brought forward some concerns about some of the entities, but the accreditation panel and the Secretariat were able to respond to those concerns, and thus all of the entities were approved. In terms of policies and reports at B24, there was an updated gender policy and gender action plan approved by the board after some debate. There was also a co-financing policy approved, which highlights how co-financing should and should not interact with GCF funding. The board discussed strategic planning for 2020 to 2023, which is something that Diana will speak about shortly. And there was a report from the GCF replenishment in which we saw $9.78 billion pledged for the second round of funding for the GCF. We're going to be hearing from Diana, who did attend the board meeting.
Hi everyone, my name is Diana Dorman. I was able to attend B24 in Songdo last week, and I wanted to give an overview of the topics that gained the most attention over the 3 days of the meetings, the strategic plan and accreditation framework. So day 1 began with the typical review of reports and activities of the board and secretariat. And then the 2020 to 2023 strategic plan was quickly integrated into these conversations. The strategic plan is scheduled to be introduced for adoption at B25, with the document still under development. And the strategic plan for 2020 to 2023 will act as a guide for the GCF1 replenishment period, setting a theory of change for how the GCF will accomplish its paradigm-shifting mandate. And although the only decision taken at B24 directly related to the strategic plan was a planning document, many other policies discussed were intended to inform and frame the development of the strategic plan. So the strategic plan agenda item was introduced on day 3 and was quickly adopted, and it decided that the GCF would hold an informal board meeting open to active observers as well as the board from February 5th to the 7th, 2020 in Monrovia, Liberia, for the specific purpose of discussing the strategic plan. Leading up to the informal board meeting, there will be an open comment period for board members as well as active observers through December 20th, 2019 that will inform the Secretariat's updated draft of the strategic plan, and all of these documents are supposed to be published online. Day 2 included a lengthy dialogue regarding the consideration of accreditation proposals, which fed directly into Day 3, which began and ended with discussions on matters related to the accreditation framework. So this topic was initially introduced on Day 1 for comments from the board, and the dialogue on the accreditation framework spanned several hours throughout Day 3. So the first part of the policy addressed the reaccreditation process, which needed to be kickstarted in order for the first round of AEs to reapply for accreditation before a lapse in their accreditation status happens. And this policy was heavily revised from the comments received from the board during Day 1 and adopted at the end of Day 3, initiating the reaccreditation process. So the Secretariat is advising that although the reaccreditation process should be considerably shorter than the initial accreditation timeline, AEs should pursue reaccreditation at least 6 months prior to the accreditation expiration. The second part of this policy was intended to initiate the project-specific assessment approach, or the PSAA. And the PSAA has been in development for a few years now and was formulated to respond to the transformative projects that had been received during the RFP process from organizations that were not accredited. And although the board expressed considerable support for this policy, there were still issues the board wanted to address before adopting it, and therefore pushed the matter to be discussed and decided at B25. So in all, it was a very productive meeting, and this concludes my updates of B24. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. That was really interesting. So, as Diana said, moving forward, the GCF is going to be working on its strategic planning for the next few years. The Independent Evaluation Unit's evaluation policy was also deferred to 2020, and the new board co-chairs for 2020 will be elected between the meetings. In terms of important dates moving forward, we see in February the informal board meeting to address strategic planning in Liberia. Then on the 9th of March, the board will hold an informal work session, followed by B25 in Songdo, which will be from March 10th to 12th. That's it for my presentation. Thanks so much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sadie and Diana. Really appreciate those insights and from going through all the detail of what was happening at the board. That's very useful for us. So what we're going to do now is have some question and answers just up until the end of the webinar at 2 UK time. So where do we want to start? I think with the first question here I have on the list was from Fiona Ryan. She wrote, most of the issues are that were raised in that first presentation from our GCF Insight would apply to ODA in general. Would you not use the current ODA systems and actors for delivering climate finance? Well, yeah, I can try and answer myself. It's not something that I have a really deep understanding on, since I've worked all my life in climate finance area. But I do know that a lot of ODA, a lot of climate finance is delivered through mainstream ODA, overseas development assistance, yeah? So this mechanism is definitely in use for climate finance. I think what something like the GCF or Green Climate Fund bring is the sort of multilateral aspect of climate finance, of addressing these multilateral issues, not so much in a bilateral one-to-one type of setting, but in a multilateral one where the money in essence is pooled. We saw this 9.78, I think, billion pledged for the next round of GCF funding, for example. That's pooled and then given to projects based on some form of equality and merit, some combination of those two. So I guess it's yes and yes. Yes, the mainstream ODA system should be used, and yes, climate finance needs perhaps something different. I think the element that also something like GCF can bring is that private sector element around co-financing, around private sector engagement and involvement. So that's my view on it. If my colleagues have anything to add there.
I would add one thing if I might.
Yeah, Mel's just popping around to the side so that okay.
Thank you. Yeah, what I would add to that is someone who has worked with ODA. When I was with the Australian government, I was sent out to Vietnam on a climate justice agenda where we were doing a lot of resilience and adaptation work. And one thing I would add to Grant's comments is that the ODA system is, of course, extremely vital for climate change going forward. But those priorities change depending on the governments in power. So we saw a governmental shift that happened. It didn't mean that climate change monies didn't continue to fund, particularly for the Australian government, the Southeast Asian community, but they did shift in priorities. So it's important to have complementary mechanisms out there as well.
Fantastic, thanks, Mel. So our next question from Derek Gibbs. Can you share which regions were surveyed? I'm from the Caribbean, so it'd be helpful to know which regions and countries had the most problems with the knowledge gaps. Sylvia is going to give an answer to this. So, Sylvia is managing to connect now. Here we go.
Okay.
Yeah, Sylvia, hello.
We
got you now.
Was not working. Yes. Yes, thank you for the questions. So for this study in particular, we actually interviewed stakeholders that work in international organizations, as well as consultants that have a global experience. So for this reason, we did not analyze the results from a regional perspective, but we wanted to actually keep a global point of view. But in the next GCF Insight issues, we actually aim at exploring each of these themes more in depth, and also we will apply surveys and stakeholders interviews, and we will of course analyze results from a geographic point of view. So thank you for these comments. I think it's really helpful.
Super, thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, then we also had a question, the name didn't come through, from the person of what other issues that manifest in either concept notes or full funding proposals or elsewhere on the knowledge gaps. We understand from this question that perhaps you're asking about how do we see these knowledge gaps do we see these same knowledge gaps in concept notes and funding proposals? Sylvia, do you want to give some additional insight there?
Yes, thank you. We do see similar insights from concept notes and full proposal development. For example, in our previous versions of the GCF Insight, we looked at issues related to proposal development, and some of the main issues were related to project finance and understanding financial mechanism. So, for example, the expected performance against the investment criteria and the financing and the cost information were considered the most challenging sections of developing a GCF proposal. So this kind of reflects the largest, the top climate finance knowledge gap that we have identified. But also similar findings are reflected into the evaluation of the readiness and preparatory support program, for instance, where it talks about knowledge gaps of local actors and direct access entities, particularly in regarding on identifying opportunities for pipeline development, but as well in developing effective funding proposals. Again, some of the same results are reflected into the evaluation of the GCF performance, which was published earlier this year, that found a mismatch, for example, into proposals developed by local actors and international entities. So definitely the GCF Insight that we just talked about identified similar issues. Yeah, thank you for the question. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thanks Sylvia. Absolutely. Our training that we do, we've recently been doing training in Uganda, how to develop GCF projects, also in Indonesia very recently. And issues that come up around the finance are, very aligned with these expert positions. Yeah. Just in the interest of time, moving on quickly, there's a question from Nicholas Ross around the GPIC 2019 event. Were there any discussions about the difficulties associated with including private sector co-financing in GCF projects or proposals led by public entities due to the provisions of GCF in insisting on including those provisions in the FAAs? Ben, you're going to give some insights into that.
Yes, absolutely. Nicholas, what an excellent question. We sort of dumbfounded by this as well, and as a requirement by the GCF that public entity implemented projects are often struggling to deal with in their FAAs. And there seems to be, there was really no discussion at the GPIC around that. However, at the board, I'm not sure if you're aware, the board members were requested to approve the policy on co-financing, which does shed a little bit more light on that as part of the review of the GCF's initial investment framework as an outcome of that. The document that was presented to the Secretariat actually laid down what the co-finance meant for GCF funded activities, as well as provided guiding principles, approaches for reporting, for example, obligations, and provisions for monitoring and evaluating both levels of co-finance. I can send, we can share a link to that after the call now. But basically, the proposed policy on co-finance was developed based on experience and lessons learned with the Global Environment Facility and the Climate Investment Funds with regards to co-financing. So you'll see some similarities there. But unfortunately, the FAAs are still a sticky point on those particular public projects. But more than happy to open up a sideline discussion at some stage with you on that.
Great, thanks, Ben. So we have two more questions. We can just squeeze them in if we're quick. On the Board B24 board meeting, a question for Sadie. Can you say more about why the World Bank's project FP123 wasn't on land use and private sector was withdrawn? Sadie, do you want to pop around here? And...
There was FP123 is a proposal from IFC, and it's in multiple countries for RED+, which is the results payment for forestry program. And so I think there are contentions kind of from multiple sides on it. From the perspective of the ITAP, which is the Independent Technical Advisory Panel, this proposal didn't have the requisite needs for, proof of country ownership, so no objection letters were not provided from the countries that were involved in the project, and so it didn't pass through them to the board. And then from the NGO side, there had been actually a kind of a campaign against this project specifically due to concerns with potential accounting for carbon credits and additionality of these credits in terms of actually, sequestering carbon, and then concerns around risk management and potentially land grabbing and violations of human and indigenous rights specifically. So I think the criticisms were kind of coming from different perspectives. That of the Secretariat and the board is that this proposal isn't ready yet, and kind of the civil society perspective, at least reflected in some of the documents they released, was that this proposal shouldn't move forward at all due to some of the questionable assumptions. But I think it's likely that this proposal will come back in later board meetings once they have kind of further reviewed what the project is actually trying to do.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sadie. Good. All right. I think we're out of time. I wanted to just draw your attention to the poll. We had in total, it doesn't give me a total, got to add that together, around 24 or so, 25 responses, with most people choosing the private sector engagement and market transformation and financial instruments and private sector. Those 2 of the 5 areas came up top in the poll. It does reflect my own view, although the climate finance fundamentals is also an important issue. When we do the training, we see that people understand grants and not very much more. So when you're looking at more sophisticated types of finance, that's very rare to have that understanding. The private sector engagement is a huge challenge. We get approached by private sector companies often, and the question is, how can they access climate finance? And the answer is not easily at all. So we continue with our campaign to try and build capacity, build knowledge, and spread the news information around how to access climate finance, doing our best to help with that. Thank you to everyone for participating. We've had a good turnout that have stuck through the whole webinar. Thanks to the whole team here. There's a whole lot of people behind the scenes as well. Mariella and Jessica, thank you very much for working behind the scenes on the webinar. It's really appreciated. And do stay in touch, sign up on our latest thinking newsletter, which goes out regularly. You get announcements there. As Ben mentioned, get in contact with us as well. We're interested to carry on the conversation. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.